Good evening, everybody. My name is Nushin Arfani, and I am the U.S. representative. It's U.S. representative, and I'm really delighted to welcome you to our December Wits Fund Indaba. We've had two others this year, and I'll share those links with you later. The first one, which was with Professor Rubenstein, who's actually on the call tonight too. So thank you very much for being here. Tonight is informal. It's a chance for people who have similar interests to get to meet each other in a kind of convivial atmosphere, listen to great stories, and make old and new friends. And that's really what the purpose of these webinars are, is to be a platform for both personal and professional links to each other. So what will happen tonight is that I'll introduce our other board member who is going to be facilitating the conversation. And then Indran will say a little about himself, a little about George, and then George will talk about his life and his robots. And then we'll have a little bit of a Q&A between Indran and George, and then open it up to everybody else. We should be done by the top of the hour, and then we'll leave the room going until, so you can say hi and continue to have the conversation. So it's also my pleasure to introduce Indran, who is one of our esteemed board members. There's about 20 in the Wits Fund board. They're all experts in their fields, various fields. Indran is a senior technical lead at IBM, where he is a member of the IBM Academy of Technology. He is IBM's architect certification under their board, and is an IBM master inventor. So I can't think of anyone who'd be better suited for the conversation with George than Indran. Indran, please, over to you.
Thanks, Nushin. And, it's really great to be able to share this evening with all of you, the distinguished alumni, and the other Wits Fund board members. As Nushin mentioned, the point of this Indaba is to feature prominent Witsies like Professor George Konidaris, and for all of us to reconnect, learn, explore, celebrate with each other all that we got back from our alma mater. I found myself in the US through IBM, who brought me here in around 1999 to work across and develop IBM's ecosystem in North America and Asia. Fortunately for me, they also sent me back to South Africa to lead a developer and startup program across the continent. And at the time, I worked alongside the IBM Research Lab, which has a Wits partnership in the Shamalong precinct, as well as the IBM research team in Nairobi. When I came back to the US, I took on a technical leadership role with some of IBM's larger accounts. And throughout my life's journey, when I look back, I've always been very appreciative of my education at Wits, which I believe prepared me well for everything that I've been able to do. And I'm honored to be able to serve on the Wits Fund board, especially with esteemed colleagues like Nushin and George Konidaris, and Bruce is also on the call as well. My background pales in comparison to George's. In our first two Indabas, we had Dr. Arthur Rubenstein, who's on our call. He's a world-renowned endocrinologist, and we had Dr. David Fine, who's an out-of-the-box thinker and a maverick when it comes to developing leading chemical innovations. But today we're very fortunate to have an equally accomplished speaker in the field of AI and robotics. So it's really my great pleasure to be able to introduce Professor George Konidaris. Professor George Konidaris is an associate professor of computer science at Brown University, where he directs the Intelligent Robot Lab. He's also a co-founder and chief roboticist of Realtime Robotics, a startup based on hardware accelerated motion planning, which he co-founded while he was a professor at Duke. I have no idea where you find the time, George. But real-time robotics has some significant groundbreaking technology, and it's been described as one of the world's leading voices in industrial automation. And just this year, real-time robotics was named the 2022 InnoMadness champion by one of Boston's leading business and technology publications. Professor Konidaris got his BSc and BSc honors at Wits in 2001, and he did his master's at the University of Edinburgh, and went on to do his Ph.D. at the University of Massachusetts in Amherst. He also serves on the advisory board of the Deep Learning Indaba, whose mission it is to strengthen machine learning and AI in Africa. Their aim is to work towards the goal of Africans being not only observers and receivers of the ongoing advances in AI, but also shapers and owners of these technological advances. So George is deeply connected back to the continent we all hold so dearly. George is also the recipient of an NSF CAREER Award, the Young Faculty Awards from DARPA, and the Air Force Office of Scientific Research, the Richard B. Salomon Faculty Research Award, and Karen T. Roma Award for undergraduate advising from Brown. Before this talk, I had no idea there were so many awards out there, and it just seems like George got all of them. Prior to joining Brown, he held a faculty position at Duke and was a postdoctoral researcher at MIT. George has over 100 publications and patents, and I'm sure that over the next few minutes, we're really going to gain a lot as he shares some of his life's journey with us. So over to you, George.
Thank you, Indran. That's incredibly kind. I promise that the awards that I won are just a small fraction of the lesser type, but I'm still only late middle age, so I've got some time. If you ask me where I find the time, it's actually because I'm a night owl in part because of 5FM. If you all remember this in Johannesburg, all the best music was on very late at night, and so during my formative years, I found that was the best time to be awake and doing work, and that's kind of stuck with me throughout my life. But you know, one of the reasons why I'm so pleased to get to talk to all of you, and one of the reasons why I've you know had the privilege of trying to give back to Wits is because, you know, we've heard this idea, this kind of South African idea of Ubuntu. This, you know, we are who we are because of other people, and that's very much true for me. And I am who I am because of two sets of people. One is my family, which I'll talk about in a bit, and the other is because of Wits. I am 100% who I am, and have had the opportunities that I've had, and the sheer good fortune of being able to ride a little bit of the technological wave that's been happening lately because of I just happened to grow up 13 kilometers away from the best university in Africa, and so when I went to the university of my hometown, it just happened to be this tremendous place. But if we rewind a bit, my career actually begins with my sister, Tanya, who's on this call. My sister went to Wits ahead of me, about 10 years before me. And when she was at Wits, she studied computer science and economics. I think she studied mostly economics. I'm not sure that she remembers that much computer science, but it was very fortunate for me because in our house on the East Rand, there was a very large stack of computer science textbooks that I was able to rifle through when I was a high schooler. And then after that, Tanya graduated and became a banker at Standard Corporate Merchant Bank, which was very fortunate for me too, because then we could pay for me to go to Wits. So I really trace my roots to that, to my intellectual roots, to being able to pull from my sister's textbooks, and also because I was unusually educated about what it meant to go to Wits. I figured out quite early in high school. I don't know if you all remember this, but there used to be a certain number of points you needed to get into the degree programs at Wits. And rather unfortunately for my parents, I found out quite early in high school how many you needed to get to do computer science at Wits. And then I figured out how many I needed I bunked the rest of school, roughly speaking, so that I could go through my sister's computer science textbooks and learn to program. And I'm quite proud to say that I hit that number right on the head. I got the exact number I needed to go to do computer science at Wits. It was, you know, I remember growing up and thinking that was the place to be, in part because all of those cars had that blue sticker on the back. I'm not sure if everyone remembers it, that just said Wits. I remember seeing that everywhere when I was a kid. So the first thing I did when I got to Wits was buy one of them and stick it on the back of my City Golf. Anyway, so high school for me was largely absent in the service of learning to program, but arriving at Wits was like a revelation. For one thing, it turns out that I was not actually that weird, that there were many of us, and that during orientation week. That was a very happy moment to find so many smart people on the lawns in O week. And you know, when I think back to my first year crowd, I can count, I think, 4 professors and 5 or 6 people who started their own companies that are doing really, really outstandingly cool stuff. And we all just got to hang out together. We were all just brought to this one place, introduced to each other, and in part, we all grew up together intellectually, but it was a real intellectual revolution for all of us to be able to meet that crowd and to be able to work with such smart people. It's not an exaggeration to say that that built the foundation of everything that I've done. It just so happened that Wits had the best computer science department on the continent. It just so happened for me, but it was the result of really very hard work of the people who staffed that computer science department. It's amazing in retrospect how lucky I was that those people had fought so hard against the pressure from industry, actually at that time largely, which wanted computer science departments to produce people who were very good at like programming in specific programming languages that were the useful thing to do at that time. And the Wits computer science department insisted that technology would change, that all of that was transient, and really you needed to teach the basic principles, the underlying core ideas in the field, and those would stay the same. And of course they were right. You know, I must have programmed in 15 languages by now, and I'm always able to pick up the relevant one from the task. The programming language that the banks and insurance companies wanted Wits to teach solely, I won't name it, but it's long dead. It's long gone, but the sort of core principles that I was taught by such an excellent computer science department are still there and form the basis of everything I do today. In part because they're eternal, and in part because they made me do a lot of math, which quite against my will, actually, but it turned out to be incredibly important for my future career. It made me a clear thinker to the extent that I'm a clear thinker. And actually, I do more math most days than computer science. But it was at Wits that I decided that, you know, computer science was cool enough that it was sufficient to spend my intellectual lifetime on, that I found such interesting challenges there, and the way of thinking about the world was so interesting and crystal clear and powerful. If you all remember, that was, well, you may not remember, but that was the sort of late 90s blending into the 2000s. So I'd grown up watching that show beyond 2000. 2000 seemed like a magical time when we were going to get, you know, flying cars and all that sorts of stuff. And there was a little bit of frustration that wasn't there. On the other hand, the internet had just begun to happen. And I was young enough to, or old enough maybe, to have experienced it when it was still cool, before it kind of got boring and commercialized. So I got to Wits with full of excitement about technology and what we could think about building. And then I decided I wanted to be a computer scientist. And there were sort of 2 things I thought I might do. And one of them was networking, because that had, you know, the internet had just taken over the world and really changed everything. And that seemed fundamentally cool. And the other one is that the idea that the brain was a computer, the sort of core idea behind AI, sounded very intriguing to me. So I scraped together enough money to buy the introductory textbooks on those 2 fields a couple of years before I had to do courses on them. And I went down to Jutas. I don't know if you remember Jutas. And I bought those 2 introductory textbooks and I read them more or less cover to cover, which is something like reading a dictionary. It's not actually a recommended approach to doing this sort of thing, but I read them cover to cover. And at the end of them, I realized 2 things. And one of them was that networking was more or less solved, that we had a planet-wide network that seemed to work okay, and that the big questions were not there anymore. They had been resolved decades before it became commercially interesting. And the other one was that AI was the opposite. Reading the introductory AI textbook, it was super obvious that none of that was going to work. The textbook opened up by saying that AI was about how you would build an intelligent agent. And then for the rest of the textbook, there were no agents. There were just things that intelligent agents did. So it would say, you know, we're going to build an intelligent agent that's as smart as a person, could do all the things that a person can do. And then chapter 1 would be like about language. And it wouldn't talk about how language interacted with anything else. It would just study language on its own in this kind of narrow silo. And then it would talk about learning. And then it would talk about different types of learning, each in its own silo. And it was like a long list of things that an intelligence did. But none of it was what an intelligence was, which was the kind of integration of all these things into one single architecture. You know, humans are interesting because they can do all those things at the same time, and they're like revealed facets of an intelligence, right? They're like what an intelligence does, but not what intelligence is. It's like someone decides to study elephants by looking at a trunk, and another person decides to study elephants by looking at their feet, and another one by their tusks. But then those people don't talk to each other, and so they have like no idea about the core animal. And that made me very happy, because that's exactly what you want as a junior scientist. You want a field that's really important, and that also has no idea, right? Where all the big discoveries are yet to be made, where the core thing is just so clearly missing. So I thought that sounded really fun, and I would go into AI, and I would just, you know, why not? I will start to think about how you could put these isolated aspects of intelligence all back together again. I didn't know how you were going to do that, though. I didn't have any hypotheses. I just thought that seemed like a big enough question to shoot my shot on, as the kids say these days. And then I had another good stroke of fortune, which is that my sister very kindly asked me what I wanted for my 21st birthday. Because if you all remember, 21sts are a big deal in South Africa, not in America for some reason. But 21sts were a big deal in South Africa, and I said I would like to go to the States, and I would like to go and visit some universities. And so she took me to America on a shoestring budget. We visited 4 universities for my 21st birthday. One of them was MIT. And I remember this very clearly because on the way back from MIT, we walked past the MIT bookstore. And we went into the MIT bookstore, and it was like heaven for a young geek. It was like all these amazing textbooks on all these cool and fascinating things that you could study, and they were all perfect. MIT Press makes really, really outstanding books. That they feel amazing, they look amazing, and the content is obviously fantastic. And Tanya said, well, you know, these books are really expensive, dollar-rand exchange rate and all that stuff, so you can buy one. Fortunately, my time was pretty cheap because I spent the next couple of hours going through the entire place. And I found a textbook called Introduction to AI Robotics. And I remember this very clearly because the date was November 8th, 2000. And the publication date on that book is it was December 8th, 2000. And the publication date on that book is December 14th, 2000. But it was an MIT Press book, so they had it on the shelves a couple of days early. And that's what we spent our $50 on. And that book completely changed my life, because one of the things that it did was it explained that the way that you were going to build an intelligence is that you were going to realize that humans were not computers. Brains are computers, but there are no brains floating around in the world. There are no brains hanging on trees or rolling around in fields or floating on the breeze. They live inside bodies. And so humans are not computers, they're robots. And so if you're trying to think about how you might put an intelligence back together again, how you might build a complete agent, you need to start with the understanding that the analogy that you're making is the analogy of a robot to a body, more so than a brain to a computer. And that's how you're going to integrate everything back together again. So with that realization came a direction. Okay, I was going to find the parts of AI that were mostly about robots. I was going to start there, and I was going to use those to build a complete architecture of how you think about intelligence. Which, you know, as a 21-year-old kid from the East Rand seems totally plausible. did not seem unexpected or weird at all. Of course, this leads to a problem, right? Which is that if you're going to work on robotics, then you need a robot. So the next year, for my 22nd birthday, I prevailed upon my sister and another friend of his. We put our sisters together, and we bought a Lego Mindstorms kit. So I have a photo here, which I'm gonna share of my first robot. See if I can. I'm just gonna hold on. Now you get to watch someone with a PhD in computer science figure out how to use there we go. Okay, so that is Hurtle. Hurtle is a robot made out of Lego. It had a little video camera on it, and then that yellow brick there was a little central processing unit. And so we built Hurtle in the honors room at Wits, and we drove Hurtle around a little bit, and we started to like understand how it might be that you would work with a robot. That robot was $200, and we had a friend buy it in London and ship it into South Africa for us. It was the only way that you could get a Lego Mindstorms kit at the time. So that was really wonderful. I was very excited about that. I finished honors. After honors, I was persuaded to stay on at Wits for a year to lecture. So the most memorable part of that was lecturing an introductory course called Basic Computer Organization, which is about how you build circuits out of paper, because we were computer scientists, not electrical engineers, and so how you logically build circuits. But that was also a transformative experience for me, because I realized that I loved teaching. It was also fantastic because you got to see the sort of miracle of Wits, right? I remember there were 180 students in my first year class, and about 45% of them were more or less directly out of the townships, having never used a computer before. And so, you know, the introductory computer science courses were like, this is how you use a keyboard to log in. Also, let's build a circuit. But by the end of that, course, they had really understood. They knew the fundamentals of how you would build a microprocessor. It was really fantastic to see and be part of that, and that was a formative experience for me. Anyway, at the end of honors, I applied to a bunch of US PhD programs, and I got rejected from all of them. So I spoke to Sheila Rock, who's changed her name subsequently. Now she's Sarah Rakos, but she was kind of one of the linchpins of the computer science department, and she was one of my mentors and close friends. And she suggested that I should go and get a master's in the meantime, and I should do it overseas. And she'd completed her PhD at the University of Edinburgh, which was the best AI school in Europe. And she said that they knew about Wits because a bunch of Wits alumni had worked there. So I applied and I got in, and I applied for a Commonwealth scholarship and I got in. I got that to pay for my master's at Edinburgh. And then we were off to the races. Then I got to go overseas, and I got to join this massive school where so much stuff was happening. And I met really, again, incredibly smart people, many of whom are professors or entrepreneurs or thought leaders today. But you know, one of my fondest memories was discovering that the courses were no harder than an honors Wits course. That was, and that turned out to be a recurring theme. Wherever I went, it turns out that Wits honors courses were about as hard as courses get. And so everything after that was not that difficult. But as part of I actually did a master's in AI. You could get a whole degree in AI at Edinburgh, and I got to work with a couple of robots there. I have some, let's see, I have some pictures of the next robot that I went onto. So this is a small video of a robot called Ringo, and we called it that. It was just a robot that was supposed to bump into stuff and then move away. And Ringo was shaped like a beetle. So that's why we called it Ringo. And you can kind of see us following around, and then we'll stick our hand in the way and it'll stop. And then shortly afterwards, they had a competition in Edinburgh to do what they called robot rugby, which of course appeals to South Africans, as you can imagine. And so I was given the opportunity to build a robot for that tournament. And we called that robot Os, because there was a famous rugby player called Os, and I thought that was amusing that someone was named after an ox. And so there you can see me in my youth. I had a lot more hair, playing with this robot that we built. Here's us kind of working on the robot on our desk. And that was like a major step up from Hurtle, right? It was a vastly more interesting robot, capable of doing a lot more stuff, but still, in some sense, a little bit of a toy, right? But then as I went through Edinburgh and did well and did well at my courses, I was given the opportunity to work on some more interesting robots. So I wrote my thesis on a robot called Dangerous Beans. It was called Dangerous Beans because it looked like I put it in a maze. This is Dangerous Beans. It's about as tall as a half a can of soda. So it's a tiny, tiny little robot, but it was a real real research robot. And what I did with Dangerous Beans is I created a maze, sort of the same way that you might put a mouse in a maze that looked like this. You can see dangerous beans in the corner. Those dots are thumbtacks, just to give you a size of this scale of this maze. And the robot had to learn, like a mouse in a maze, to go find the food. Food's that little puck in the top left there. It's got a black stripe on it to make it easier to sort of see. And that was my first real research with a robot that resulted in a journal paper. It was a model of how a robot like a mouse could learn by interacting with a maze to be able to find its way regularly to food in a machine learning setting. So the robot was actually learning the layout of the maze. It was learning to explore in the layout of the maze in order to find the food. And Dangerous Beans was named after a novel that I'd read that had a mouse in it called Dangerous Beans. So that was really cool. I wrote some papers, won some prizes, and then I decided I should apply again. And so I applied to American PhD programs, and this time I got into quite a few of them because now I had papers and prizes and they took me a little more seriously. But this was in 2004 when the sort of Iraq war was beginning to happen. And so funding was actually quite scarce for PhD programs at the time. And so, you know, one of the schools I got into, which is one of the best schools in the world for computer science, when I arrived there, I went to visit. They said, yeah, it'd be great if you would come here. We have the following funded projects and you could join one. And you've got to do your PhD on what we have funded. And that didn't sound like what I wanted to do, actually. I wanted to chase the big question. And I didn't believe any of those projects were chasing the big question. So, you know, I remembered my Johannesburg roots and everything that I've been taught at WITS, and to think about the main chance and not to get one's head turned by the prestige of the place, and instead go after the cool question. And so I chose to go to a university called UMass Amherst, which at the time was a top 10 ranked AI university. It was not a bad university. It was not a place that was particularly famous, although there was a song by the Pixies called UMass, which was actually a major reassurance to me. I'm like, well, if the Pixies wrote a song about that, it can't be that bad, even though I had not yet heard of it before. And I went to work with a researcher who's actually famous. His name is Andy Bartow, and he was one of the founders of a field called reinforcement learning, which my reasoning about how AI would be built sort of put that field at the center of everything. It's about how an agent learns to interact with the world in order to achieve its goals. It's really the only machine learning paradigm that seriously has an agent inside. And at the time, RL was a very small, obscure field. It was very hard to get a job, a faculty job as an AI researcher. It was very hard to get your papers published, but it seemed to me to be clearly the right thing. And so I took the gamble and I moved to Western Massachusetts, which was not my idea of glamorous, but was a nice, quiet place to work. And I did a PhD at UMass Amherst. I was there for 6 years. I got to work with a few cool robots. I will show you my favorite robot from that time. Now you can see the robots are going up in sophistication. This is the U-Bot 5. Which was actually designed and built at UMass. And I did my PhD on this robot. I got it to put it inside a nice kind of, I built a maze for it again, actually very similar to the Edinburgh project. I built a little arena that it lived in, and it learned to solve a problem where it had to kind of figure out how to be able to interact with the objects in this maze, just like in psychology, a Skinner box or a Thorndike box. It had to do an instrumental conditioning task where it interacted with the objects in order to be able to escape the maze and get like a reward. And in the process of doing this, the robot discovered components of its solution that it could reuse. So it learned skills like pushing a button or opening a door. And it retained those solutions, that identified them as useful. It constructed a model of them, it retained them, and then it was able to reuse them in a second maze without having to learn them from scratch. And the argument at the time, which I think still holds and has since then become popular, but at the time was like pretty obscure, was that, you know, this is one of the main mechanisms underlying human intelligence, is that you learn the ability to do things and then you sort of package that thing, just like in programming, you would package a procedure or a function. And then you never think about how to do it explicitly. You just reason about, you know, when to do it. And you continually build up this library of things, and you can think at a higher and higher level. You know, when you're a baby, you start out waving your arms around, knowing how to do nothing. But then, you know, when you've learned to grab stuff and you've learned to pull yourself up and you've learned to walk, you've widened the envelope of what you can do behaviorally. And then because you widen that envelope, some things become easy to learn that were not easy to learn before. And then once you've learned those things, you kind of cache those, and that widens your envelope again. you know, until you're a teenager and you can drive the wrong way down Jorrison Street and make yourself a sandwich and all of that stuff. It's the slow accumulation of pieces of kind of procedural knowledge about how to do things that I still think lie at the core of a general intelligence. So that was UMass. At the end of UMass, I found myself in a very awkward job market where it was 2010 and the war was still over, but the recession had just hit and there were not many faculty jobs. So the probability of getting a professorship was very low. And so I cast about for a place to stay, and I was very lucky to meet two professors at MIT, Leslie Kelbling and Tomas Lozano Perez, who really, really liked my work. They were just a bus ride away, so I basically dropped in on their lab and said hi. And then engineered my way into giving a talk. And at the end of it, they said, we would like to offer you a postdoc. And I said, that's great. What would you like me to do? And then they said, we don't care what you do as long as it's cool, which was kind of exactly what I'd always been hoping for from my academic life. So I got to spend 4 years at MIT as a postdoc, and really that was an incredible place. It is singular in terms of how much cutting edge, creative, kind of unfettered and unconstrained work was happening there. And two things I saw really left a mark on me. One is I saw these really, really smart technical people being completely unafraid to go out there and start their own businesses and create startups based on, you know, highly technical work. And the other one was I got to see these people, you know, doing great research and then just going out there and more or less programming the field with what they thought the right answers were and becoming very well known by sheer force of personality. So I worked really hard at that. And over the time at MIT, I became reasonably prominent in my field. I wanted to show you the robot that I got to work on at MIT. This is the PR2. There were 40 of these robots made. Just to give you an idea, the blue thing on the right is a beer cooler. So it's quite a large robot. It's taller than I am. It cost about $250,000. But it was really the most interesting general purpose robot that you could get at that time. And I was really fortunate to be able to spend a couple of years, you know, playing with the PR2, thinking about how, you know, I could expand the previous sorts of things that I wanted to do onto a much more complex robot. And so after a couple of years at MIT, I'd acquired enough halo to be competitive on the faculty job market, and things were getting better. And so in 2014, I got a professorship at Duke and was kind of, you know, got to open my own lab, more or less. Things were still a little tough. I sent out 60 applications and got one job offer. But it was a very comfortable job offer at a wonderful university where they were incredibly good about letting me chase my intellectual interests. And they also let me buy my very own robot. So this robot over here, it's called Anathema Device, which is a bad name for a robot, but it's actually from a Neil Gaiman and Terry Pratchett novel. And I actually had a custom designed by a company, I think out in Waltham, actually. And it was it was like the PR2, but a little more modern. And I did all the infrastructure work myself because I was the only one in the lab for the first year. Did all the programming, and that was actually a really wonderful time to get my hands dirty for one last time before grad students did all that stuff for me. When I joined Duke, I actually had a tremendous stroke of luck, which was that I was invited to a giant faculty meeting. Those of you who are professors know that you don't go to those because they're boring and they're administrative. But I was a junior faculty member and I didn't know that, so I went. And I was the only junior faculty member there because clearly everyone else knew to not go or to ask. But there was a senior faculty member there, Dan Soren, who was a computer architect. And so Dan and I got to talking while listening to the administrators drone on. And he said, well, I design processors. And I said, well, I program robots. And we said, maybe we should get together and think about designing a processor for some or other thing that robots needs to do. And fortunately, because after my honors year at Wits, I had lectured basic computer organization, I actually understood enough about computer architecture to be able to have an intelligent, coherent conversation with Dan. And so we went for a very, very lucky lunch in the fall of 2014 at a local sandwich shop. And that lunch turned into a research question, which is, motion planning, which is one of the hard things that robots need to be able to do, which was the first paper of which was written by my postdoc advisor, Tomas Perez at MIT. We thought, well, let's design a processor to solve that. No one's done it, and this seems really important. Robots can't move around if they can't motion plan. So just to sort of place motion planning for you, if you imagine a robot has a body like you have a body, and you imagine it would like to do something like pick up this water bottle, and so it would like to put its hand over there. But its hand is somewhere else, like maybe it's underneath my desk. It needs to compute a motion through space for its whole body that goes from where it starts to where it ends, and that doesn't smack into anything. Or it doesn't hit the environment, doesn't collide with anything. And that seems like a trivial problem to you and I, because we do it hundreds of times a day. We just move our bodies around freely without hitting anything. But if you've ever had to joystick a robot through that, you actually discover very quickly that the vast majority of paths between where you start and where you end collide with something. That actually a portion of your brain is dedicated to computing these paths through space. And of course, you don't realize it because brains are tricky that way. But it's actually a computational miracle that humans are able to move around the way they do. Imagine reaching into the fridge to grab a beer. You have to move around so many things so carefully in order to be able to reach that beer past all the other things in the fridge and all the shelves and all the doors. And actually, robots couldn't do that, right? That problem had been studied for 40 years in academic circles. And the fastest algorithms took 100 milliseconds, so that's a tenth of a second, to compute one path. But in order for such an algorithm to be practical, you might need to compute 100 paths before you started to act. And Dan and I built a processor that could compute 1,000 paths a second. It was the first motion planner to break the millisecond barrier. And we immediately knew that you become an academic because, like, one day you're in the shower and you have an idea and you feel like the idea belongs to you. It's like been delivered to you by the universe or something like that. And so your job is to take it out there into the world and turn it into a real thing. And then once you've done that, your sort of job is done. But usually turning it into a real thing means you write a paper and you send it off into the ether. But in this case, it was really clear to us that the way to make this actually happen was to build this processor and go out into the world and tell people that they could move their robots around and actually change the way that robotics was done. And so we started a company called Realtime Robotics. And I wanted to show you two videos. I wanted to show you a video, a sort of before and after, just to show, what research looks like when you're doing it in your lab. This is the lab. This is the video that we showed off to claim that we'd solved motion planning. So here you can see a robot arm in the background, and then you can see some obstacles, which are cardboard boxes with some tape on them. And that robot is inside a giant wooden frame that we bought from the Home Depot, and it has to pick these things up, which are small colored blocks. Those are children's toys. And so the idea here was that a person would press the red button and the robot could instantly move. It wouldn't have to wait to plan. It could instantly compute a collision-free plan to get the box and to get the little colored block and drop it off in the box. And then you could go in there and change the world, like move around where all the obstacles were. The obstacles being cardboard boxes, you could just you could place a new block and ask the robot to plan, and it would instantly do the right thing. And this qualified as very impressive in academic circles, right? People were like, wow, this is, it's really neat that you can do this. This problem looks like it's solved from the academic point of view. See, Sean would press the button and the robot would instantly move, instead of having to wait a second or 2 seconds to be able to compute that path. And you can see when you think about it, the robot has 6 degrees of freedom. It's actually quite hard to move all 6 degrees of freedom so that there's no collision with any of the obstacles, right? That's the motion planning problem. So that was like from the lab. But then we went out there and we built a company around this. And so far we've raised $50 million. We employ about 85 people. We are shortly to roll our motion planning system out onto the factory floor of one of the big 5 automakers, and the others are following. And just to show you what such a thing looks like when you take it to real industry. these are two robot arms doing spot welding on it, or pretending to do spot welding on a car door. You know, there's no cardboard or tape. They're kind of doing motion planning in real time, and they're motion planning around each other, right? So they're able to generate their motions. You just tell the robot where you want the weld to happen, and it computes the motions on its own, instead of having had them designed by a human. But that's what a real industrial robot looks like, right? No robots with tape. That's no cardboard boxes, no wooden frames, actual fitted pieces and real work done. So that's kind of where robotics has taken me and my education at Wits has taken me. In 2016, I had the opportunity to move to Brown. My wife's family is from New England, and those of you in academia know that that you go where the job takes you, because you only usually get one job offer, and your spouse just has to come with you, and that sucks for them. And so I had the opportunity to fix that by moving back to where she was from. So I took that in 2016. I've been at Brown since. Originally, I wanted to get hired there originally, but they already had a roboticist doing what I did in 2014 when I got the job at Duke, but that person left. And so I got a very happy phone call in late 2015 asking me to apply. And I got tenure last year, which is very kind of them, but now they're stuck with me. I'm not sure that they entirely know what they've done. But one last thing, that I wanted to talk about very briefly was, Wits has meant so much to me over these years, and I've been really privileged to be able to give something back. So since my time at MIT, I've been co-supervising PhDs at the Wits Computer Science Department. I co-supervised 4 PhDs. I've been there. I've been 2 of whom are now lecturers at Wits Computer Science. I got to work closely with them to help build up their research program. I can tell you that the Wits students are as talented as students anywhere in the world, including Brown. And in 2017, we put our heads together, and I can't take a lot of credit for this. Most of the credit actually goes to the people at Wits and the other members of the founding thing. But we founded, we decided that we needed to bring all this stuff. We needed to kind of really share this stuff with Africa, that there was all this exciting stuff happening, but it just wasn't happening back home. So we founded what we call the Deep Learning Indaba. You can see this image, which was just, just like originally it was founded as a kind of workshop. We said that, okay, we're going to have a workshop. We're going to invite people from all over the continent. We'll do it at Wits, because of course we'll do it at Wits, because that's the root of all of these things. And we'll, and maybe 50 people will want to come. And so we'll give them a tutorial on machine learning, and then we'll send them back to their home countries. But actually we got 600 applicants. And Wits was able to accommodate 300 of those 600 applicants. You can see them all here. This is the new science stadium, which is built on West Campus. I'm still getting over that we're on the West Campus now, computer science, but it's a little far from the lawns for my liking, but that's fine. And, everyone came together. We had this tremendously impactful events. There were people from 22 African countries at this. And then the next year was held at Stellenbosch. Instead of getting 600, we got 800 applicants, and we were able to host 400 of them. And then that year we had 13 Indaba X events, which were smaller versions in 13 different African countries. And then the year after that, we did it in Kenya, and we got 900 applicants, and we had 600 of them come. And then it was paused during the pandemic, but there were 2,200 applicants for the Indaba this year. I think 600 or 700 of them went to it in Tunisia, and it's now a Pan-African movement. There are, the first year it was a workshop. People came, we taught them how to do machine learning. The second year, when they showed up at Stellenbosch, they told us about the machine learning they were doing, and it turned into a research meeting. And now we have this whole wave of African researchers, going to do PhDs overseas. We set up a special program to sort of train them about how you would apply and what that would look like and how to prepare yourselves. And the first few people that went on that wave are beginning to come back, filling up the universities in South Africa and Africa, across the continent. And we've really seen just this amazing reservoir of talent just explode. It's been incredibly cool to watch. And of course, all this happens because of a university that happened to be down the road from where I grew up by sheer dumb luck. So, all right, that's my monologue. finished. Thank you all for listening and being patient while I rambled on. Thank you.
Yeah,
I think
that was amazing, George. I thought I'd read up a lot about you. I was impressed with all that I read, but I'm even more impressed hearing you say it and take us through your journey. That's incredible. Thank you.
oh, it's my pleasure.
So while the other Witsies get their questions together, I thought maybe we'll just seed a couple while everyone else is thinking about them. You mentioned, that you're still involved with the program at Wits. You've worked with PhD students from there. What advice do you give those students? Like many of the alumni on this call, we have family, friends. We also mentor some students there. What type of advice do you give students there that's deciding what to do with their lives, pursuing science, getting into AI, ML? What type of things do you tell them so we could steal a little and share with them too?
Sure. So the thing I tell them is that it's really good to be at the beginning of something, preferably before the beginning of something. And so if you're going to be a scientist, it's foolish to chase the thing that's already happening. If you hear a lot of people talking about it, it's probably too late. And so really you should chase the big questions, because that's where the interesting opportunities are. And we live in like an unprecedented age, right? I mean, I grew up on the East Rand. My dad was a pharmacist. My sister largely paid for me to go to university. And then I got the rest of my higher education paid for just by virtue of being promising. And I don't have to be an aristocrat or anything like that. It doesn't have to be. It's by sheer talent and hard work, you can get to a lot of the places you would like to get to. And then you should just decide what's worth your intellectual lifetime, and you should take the biggest shot you can find. And that it's okay. It's far preferable to fail while daring greatly than to succeed while doing something small. And I think there are now many examples of really accomplished South Africans, including Arthur Rubinstein and David Fine and others, who show that you can get anywhere from Wits, and so you should aim for anywhere. You should aim for the biggest thing that you can find. Also, you should do as much math as you can. That's a more pragmatic thing, but take all the math classes you can, because you're going to need them.
That's great advice, George. What are your thoughts, like, staying on the continent? What are your thoughts around AI in Africa? What do you see happening on the continent? How do you see this field growing or affecting the continent?
So I think, and this is a subject close to my heart, I think what we are seeing is that there's a lot of enthusiasm from the West or developed countries to apply AI in Africa. They have frequently tried, and they have always failed, because they will parachute in without any understanding of the context. And they will imagine it is as it is at home. And then they'll kind of spend a lot of money building a program, and then they'll leave. A program, I mean like a piece of software or an AI application. And it's just a consistent record of failure. And so I think the fundamental upshot is that this needs to be indigenous. It has to be developed by Africans and for Africans. And so I think the right place to put our efforts is to develop kind of indigenous research capability across Africa. And so in the Indaba is an effort to do that. There are some other efforts coming up, and watch the space. They'll be announced in the next couple of months. But we're pushing really hard to be able to say, let's train a generation of people who will go back to Africa and have them build their own technology for their own needs in their own local contexts. That's the only way to make it sustainable and actually successful at all. Does that make sense?
Yeah, that makes sense. That makes sense. Africa, innovation in Africa for Africans by Africans.
By Africans, yeah. And you've seen a lot of stuff about how AI is often biased, and most frequently, but not solely, the bias is because of a data set bias, right? So like voice recognition and image and face recognition were much better at white men because they were trained in labs where most of the researchers were white, and they also happened to be like 25 to 35. So they were really good at that. And then that's been fixed somewhat in America. But if you take face recognition that's been trained on Americans, even if it includes African Americans, and then you take that to like the Congo, it's actually not going to port. Or if you take it to Ethiopia, it's not actually going to port. You really do need these things to be localized in some sense.
George, this is Arthur. That was a great talk. I really enjoyed it. Where would you say the biggest successes have been in terms of the practical application of robots and all the things you have developed from theoretical basis to practical application?
So, okay, there are actually, AI as a whole has actually a lot of very successful applications, but they're usually invisible. So I'll just give you a couple examples. In robotics, all of the welding on anyone's car was done by a robot. And you know, my car is a Toyota Camry. I bought it for $16,000 new, and it has a lifetime warranty. And that's a miracle of industrialization. And that's due to robots. Now, those robots are not smart. In fact, they're astoundingly dumb. But that's not unusual that the technology sort of trails what can be done in academia. In terms of machine learning and AI, I mean, we've seen a lot of cool stuff happen recently. But actually, the things I think you'll find most interesting are a lot older than that. So, for example, every time you use your credit card, that transaction is checked, is run against a fraud check. And those fraud checks are actually done with machine learning, and they have been for a couple of decades. So whenever you get an email saying, you know, and that's a weird transaction, was that really you? The thing that detected that was a machine learned decision tree typically. And, you know, it's not obvious to people that that's been happening in your life, but it has quietly in the background. Another two examples. One example is if you go to Orbitz or what's the other one? You know, those places where you say, hey, I want to fly from Johannesburg to Los Angeles on Tuesday afternoon, going through at most 2 stops. That's actually in the background that runs an AI search technology. So the company that developed that was called STA. It was based in Cambridge, and it used very classical AI techniques to find those routes. That was actually a very hard search problem. People don't know that it's AI because it just works, but it does. And then a third application, which I tell my students, which has been going on for decades now, is zip codes. So I don't know if you know this, but whenever you write a zip code on an envelope and you mail it, it's actually scanned by an optical scanner, and the zip code part is isolated, and those numbers are recognized by a digit recognizer that was built using machine learning. And so that's been routing all of your mail for the last couple of decades, right? These things are actually everywhere, but they're just like the field of AI, which is that they're tiny little narrow applications that slot kind of very neatly into everyday life and aren't visible. They're not general intelligences or anything like that. They're just small pieces of engineering that work well. Now, of course, lately we've seen, you know, language models and DALL-E and all that stuff. We've seen very visible things, but AI has always been actually working in the background. It's just usually in very narrow cases. Does that answer your question, Arthur? I was a bit long-winded there. Sorry about that.
Yeah, thank you.
And then I think Stephen Bradlow had his hand up. If
yes, Stephen, go ahead.
Hi. So thanks very much. That was a fascinating talk, and I enjoyed all the sort of personal background, and it was nice to see your sister on the talk too. She was obviously bursting with pride, and that was nice to see. I want to go back to what you were talking about before the previous question, where you were talking about the need to develop indigenous talent and train African scientists. So I wanted to give a little plug for the African Institute of Mathematical Sciences. I don't know if you have any connection with AIMS, but I mean, it seems like...
indirectly, but they're doing wonderful work. They're really wonderful.
I mean, a course by you or somebody in your field along the lines you've been talking about would be perfect. And for those who don't know, this organization started by Neil Turok has exactly the aims that you articulated there, to train indigenous scientists in Africa. And they run a 1-year course with a goal. I mean, they call it a master's course, and the goal is really to just raise the scientific level of the students who come from all over Africa. So if you don't have any connection with them, it would be great, and I'd be happy to talk more with you about it to try and broker that deal.
So actually, I don't have a direct connection with them, but a bunch of the Indaba Ubuntu, as we call ourselves, have. And actually what ended up happening was there's a branch of AIMS in Rwanda. And that branch started an African Masters in AI in 2018 as a kind of result of the Indaba. And so they have a master's training program that's AI specific, which is really magnificent. It's also got an acceptance rate of something like 5%. I mean, they get like thousands of applicants from the continent, and it's fully paid for. And they really turn out amazingly talented people, but it's kind of rate limited, right? Like I think they train about 40 or 50 people a year, which is wonderful, and those people go on to do PhDs, but it's not massively, you need all the universities to be able to do that. But Ames is, I mean, I've always been a big fan of Ames. I was just annoyed that they did it in Cape Town rather than Johannesburg, but I guess that's where the international lecturers would prefer to go.
Beach. I mean, that's hard to beat.
I guess so.
So, guys, please, if you've got a question, raise your hand, or, we can call you out. But Tanya, we thought we'd, since you're such an implicit part of George's inspiration, would you like to say a few words or tell us something about George that he might be interesting to share?
Previous speaker mentioned just how proud I am of him, and I'm just astounded at George's, first of all, integrity. So I think that's the side of him, the mentoring that he's done, the friendships that he's built over the years. George as a person, the incredible father that he is, matches his sort of intellectual prowess, hand in hand. So he's just a very impressive person with a lot of integrity. And I think that's also what I'm incredibly proud of him. I also laugh sometimes because I spent 10 years at the World Bank doing development. And I sometimes look at George and think that single-handedly, he's done more for Africa with his, helping to staff up Wits computer science, starting the Indaba, the things that are going to be in the news shortly, than I did in 10 years at the World Bank, just in terms of development and giving back. So I'm incredibly proud of that as well. And just his productivity. I mean, I also look at him and go, where do you fit this all in, and mostly he doesn't sleep. But
it's Barney Simon's fault. It's Barney Simon's fault. He's to run that. Anyway,
yeah, but just what you see is what you get. He's just an incredibly good person with a lot of integrity, and I'm super proud of him.
Thanks, Tanya. It's awesome to see. It looks like this giving DNA is giving is part of the DNA of this family. So we're very proud to have you as part of the Wits family. I think we have another question. Roy, you had a question.
Yeah. So George, really enjoyed the talk, and actually lots of parallels growing up at Wits and then being now in Massachusetts. And I came the electrical engineering part, not the computer science part. We're seeing an explosion of visibility into AI, particularly in the last year with these very accessible, language models. And how do you see that's going to transform the impact of AI in our everyday lives?
So, I mean, I think at this point, it's hard to deny that it is going to be transformative. I think it's hard to see exactly how. I mean, okay, there's two things going on, right? One of them is AI as a science, trying to understand how to build a general intelligence like you or me, and it's important to understand that these are not that, right? They're narrow. The language models don't understand what they're saying because there's no, they're text-to-text translators. There's no grounding. The meanings of words are absent. So in that sense, these things are incredibly useful tools, but they don't answer the question of how we build a general AI, and that's still open and will take a couple centuries probably. But they are, I remember the first thing that you think when you're an undergrad and you study AI is you read about machine learning, you're like, wow, that'd be amazing. We could just learn everything and we wouldn't have to do any more engineering. And then the reality that you hit almost immediately was that, no, actually, you can learn almost nothing and everything breaks. But that started to change. And I think it's now beginning to be the case that we can learn an awful lot of stuff, and an awful lot of things will be automated. And I mean, we have to be very careful. They're not, because they're meaningless fundamentally, you can't have a real conversation. I would be very nervous about putting a customer on the other side of one of those. But I think we'll be able to hook up an internet's worth of data to these things and get, it's already the case that a large number of people whose blogs I follow have the graphics on their blogs automatically generated by DALL-E. They don't hire designers anymore. They just type in a prompt, they fiddle with it until they're happy, and then they drop them in. And that's like, 2 years ago, that would have been insanity, right? I think personally, very soon, I think actors will be automatically generated to match the characters in books. I think actors will go away as a class of extremely famous people. And I think that at some point music will start to become a little more automated too, which will be wild. So, but 5 years maybe. So,
interesting.
It's going to be fun. It's just hard to predict because it's so explosive, right? I mean, the technology is so. It's not like a one tiny thing we've just broken open. It's a big, wide open envelope.
Lots to look forward to.
Yes.
Yeah. Or not. So George, some light questions, just to some quick ones. What was your favorite spot on the Wits campus?
Oh, the library lawns, unquestionably. I had the worst farmer's tan at the end of, I think I was educated largely in the library lawns, actually. In fact, when I went back after my master's at Edinburgh, there was someone sitting under my tree. And I don't think I've ever been quite so offended because I'd spent 4 years under that tree and I'd just gone away for a year and someone had waltzed up to it like it was free and planted themselves there. And I wanted to be like, hey, but that's part of life. The institution moves on and all that stuff. But whenever I go back, I take like an hour and I nap under that tree. It was lovely.
Yeah, so share a favorite memory of you that you have of growing up in Joburg. By the way, I'm also on the East End, probably further east than you. I'm from Springs, so you probably somewhere between Springs and Joburg. So, what's your memories?
I grew up in Bedfordview, and my favorite memory was, I don't know, the 80s, man. They were a special time, and so I remember having big furry slippers and a gown. And my dad taking me to the Bedford Center to the convenience store and getting a slush puppy and two 20-cent coins and being able to play like for half an hour on the arcade in my gown and my slippers. That was magical. So I must have been about 6 or 7, but that was great. So,
and the last one from me: will robots take over the world?
No, definitely not. If they do, it will be centuries, not decades.
And we'll come back to you if you do.
If they're right.
We'll remind you. Guys, you're welcome to stay on, ask any questions. The mic's open. Anyone else got any questions before we close down? Thanks again, George, for the amazing evening. We think this is the best hour I've spent in quite a while. And thank you.
Thank you, George.
Thank you all for listening, and thank you for the opportunity. And I hope to meet those of you I haven't met in person. I hope to meet in person sometime soon at a reunion. So
thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot.
George. That was fantastic. Thank you so much.
Thank you.